Things seemed to fall into a bit of a routine after that, with Phasma busy performing other duties. Sometimes it was just you hosting the training sessions. Not that you minded. Everyone had pretty much figured out after the first day that Phasma was grooming you to be in charge, although you had to admit that she had mostly sat back and let you take the reins. At first you were afraid that you didn't know what you would do or how to teach, but fortunately Phasma left you a schedule of things to teach them, which were all extremely basic and not complicated by any means. How to free yourself if you were pinned down. How to wrestle a blaster out of someone's hands if they were pointing it at your face, and so on. Not that they all got it right away, but you let them practice. You took it that this was more of a class for stress relief than actual defense anyway, but you let yourself take it seriously and pretend as though you were training your own little army. Sometimes you would tell Kylo that you were training a badass squadron of fighters to take command of the First Order, starting with the fat lady that worked in the cafeteria and the older guy with a bald head that worked in maintenance. Kylo would laugh at you, then, and ask if you were suggesting treason, to which you always promptly replied that it was only treason if you really meant it. Personally, you felt like you could probably do a better job running the base than Hux did, but then again, you didn't even really know what Hux did, so you reserved judgment. It's not like you had actually seen him again either, so it wasn't really a concern for you. But, all in all, teaching them was good fun, and you enjoyed it a lot. Sometimes you would walk back and forth between them, pretending that you really were Kylo Ren, and these were stormtroopers that would obey your every order without question. During drills, you would sometimes approach a specific person and demand that they drop down on their hands and perform 20 push-ups, and they would do it too, with only minor hesitation and silent grumbling. It was one of those things that brought a smile to your face, the fact that someone was willing to do what you told them to do without really getting anything in return. That was what you called it, anyway. Ladson called it an abuse of power and asked if you should get your own personal helmet as well. You joked that you might be interested, but it would probably mess up your hair, and you had no desire to look like a frazzled mess every time you took the helmet on and off. Kylo had somehow managed to look perfect every time he took his helmet off, a forced trait you weren't sure if you had learned yet. But your hair was also a lot longer, and helmets really weren't your thing anyway. You saw Ladson about once a week, sometimes twice, but those were rare instances. He joked around with you sometimes, but you could still tell that there was a change in his demeanor. He was more taciturn and more quiet, staring out into space for long periods of time. You could tell that he hadn't been in any battle because there were no scuffs on his armor yet, but you supposed that would only be a matter of time. Regardless, you don't talk to him about that, or his training, knowing that he probably doesn't have the clearance to answer your questions. Instead, you just try to support him as best you can, letting him know that you're there for him on things that he can talk about and cracking stupid jokes to help distract him from the things he can't. You still don't know what had happened to Shane. You hadn't seen him around base. You'd even asked a few people at self-defense class that were older and didn't seem as intimidated by you if they had seen him, but no one had. It was like he had simply vanished, and although you knew that probably wasn't the case, you couldn't help but recall what Ladson had said. Maybe Shane had ran his mouth just a little too much and really had gotten himself taken into space and thrown out of an airlock. Eventually, you decide that it's a lost cause and stop trying to look for him. He was a grown man. Taking care of himself was really his problem. You could only do so much. You were only one person, and you had come to realize that you couldn't save everyone. You weren't sure if this realization was based off maturity or cynical in nature, but the reason for it didn't matter. It didn't change the fact that you doubted you would ever see Shane again. You weren't sure if you would ever see Sadie again either, but you were at least comforted by the fact that you knew now that Kylo had saved her. Ladson, too, seemed comforted by what you had seen in Kylo's head, and although you had no way to know if whatever pilot Kylo had sent her off with really did deliver her to her intended destination, you had no way to know for sure, and so it probably wasn't worth thinking about. Sadie was probably home, safe, with her father, probably going back to school for something or another. You weren't sure if she would go back to interpreting or not. She had changed, that much was obvious from the last time you had seen her, and you could only hope that her father would patiently listen to what she had been through. He would never understand. It was one of those things that you could never understand unless you lived through it, but you hoped Sadie was finding ways to heal regardless. Now that you had taken over the training sessions, it actually freed up a little bit of Phasma's time, and you began to regard her as somewhat of a friend. She would come visit you after your training sessions had been completed and spar with you, although considering her size, you mostly both resorted to just sparring with your staffs. You still sparred with Kylo, of course, but he was obviously much, much better than you. Phasma did not have that much experience with a staff, and so her skill level was more on par with yours, although sometimes she would teach you new tricks, how to spin your staff, or subtle ways to surprise your opponents. Unfortunately, you were usually the one at the mercy of such attacks before she taught you how to do it yourself, but it didn't faze you in the least. You were always eager to take any new scrap of training and master it, so you could turn around and subdue Kylo with it later. You hardly ever managed to catch him off his guard, but there were a few times when you managed to almost defeat him that you knew your skills had vastly improved. But every night you returned home to Kylo, or rather, Kylo returned home to you. Sometimes you went on missions, but those were few and far between. Most only lasted a few days, but considering you had your self-defense lessons to keep you busy, and Ladson was allowed to stay with you and keep you company while he was away, it almost seemed worth it, especially considering the makeup sex you had with him when he came home. You still sparred with him, but it seemed to happen less and less as time passed. After all, you sometimes tuckered yourself out from your self-defense classes, or from sparring with Phasma, and Kylo was sometimes just too exhausted mentally from dealing with Hux to take his aggression out on you. You had learned from Phasma that his bursts of anger were actually a seldom occurrence as of late, and you weren't sure if it was because you were mentally able to shield him because of your force bond, or if it was because you seemed to provide him with some small glimmer of happiness that he had been missing before. You could tell when some days were especially rough for him by the way he would come home and just touch you, feeling your warm skin under his hands as if to prove to himself that you were really there. You still tell him that you love him now and again, not every day, but moments when you really feel like you are so in love with him that your heart could burst out of your chest. You don't bother holding back. He doesn't say it back. He never has, and you begin to suspect that he never will. But that doesn't matter to you. When he is training you in the Force and he allows you to see into his mind, you can feel his emotions and you can tell how he feels about you. It's not exactly the same way you feel about him. While you would run through the corridor shouting at the top of your lungs about how much you loved him, Kylo still held back. He was still a little reserved, still a little unsure, and you weren't sure if time would erase it or if it was just something that you would always have to deal with, but you knew you would be there to support him regardless. The only thing that you could do was to make it clear that you were his, that you weren't leaving, that you never wanted to leave, and that usually was the end of that. You still hadn't learned how to do a force choke, but your other abilities were getting sharper, more refined. You could do little tricks now, like turning on the sink faucet with the force and your mind instead of your hand. You could summon your staff into your hand, and you could occasionally push people, like Phasma during sparring to make her lose her balance, although she absolutely hated that. You always blamed her 2 left feet and simply called her clumsy, but deep down you knew that she knew what you were doing. Not that you could help it. You had to practice on someone, and you knew she could take it. Practicing on Ladson just seemed mean, and although you didn't really talk about the Force with him, you could tell that he was starting to suspect that you were getting a lot more powerful than you let on. One of the more useful tools at your disposal was the ability to reconstruct a shield in your mind to separate yourself from Kylo when he was having a particularly aggressive mood swing. You could probably create a wall now, if you wanted to, but you liked having the ability to fluctuate between periods of being by yourself and periods of just being able to sense him there. It was comforting in a way that didn't really make a lot of sense. It almost felt as if his spirit was sitting right beside you, watching you, feeling everything you were feeling. Still, sometimes it was helpful to just block him off completely, just to make sure you still felt like yourself and you weren't being influenced by him too much. You were bonded now, and you couldn't help that, but you could control how you let it affect you. You could also block Kylo from getting into your head. Not completely, but you had managed to block at least visual memories from him. He still got the audio on full blast, you could sense that, but it was still a useful tool to at least mask your visual memories from him. Not that you really had anything to hide from him anymore, but it was useful to know you could if you ever needed to. Still, even if you could, you weren't sure you would ever even really want to. You had nothing to hide from him, and what's more, you had nothing to fear from him, and you hadn't for quite some time. He was never truly angry around you. He never threatened you, and he never accidentally lost his temper and grabbed you in a force choke, not even once. If anything, you felt like you had started to understand Kylo Ren and who he was a lot better now. Even though you still didn't know anything about his past, you knew his present. With the Force bond linking you together, there was nothing he could really hide from you. He never really bothered to keep his shield up, even when he was away from you, and so you could feel his momentary flashes of irritation and his occasional bursts of rage. He made no attempt to hide any of it from you, and when you weren't busy doing something else, you always tried to take the time to help send him as much positive energy as you could to help even out his mood, swallowing his anger as if it was your own and venting it in ways that he couldn't. You still didn't know what he did out there in the galaxy on his little missions. When he came back, you were always so happy to see him, so happy to let him touch you, that you didn't even think about whose blood was on his hands as he thrust his fingers inside of you. To you, that still wasn't a concern. Kylo was fighting a war, and although now you could appreciate how innocent people could get swept up in a larger conflict they wanted nothing to do with, it was up to everyone else to fend for themselves, much as you had. It wasn't your job to try to turn Kylo into a good person, because you didn't know what good was. Instead, you stuck with what you did know. You knew that you loved him, you knew that you wanted him by your side, and you were happy to be there and support him in whatever way that meant. In a way, you felt like you were finally happy. You had found your usefulness on the Starkiller Base, and it had nothing to do with being physically intimate with Kylo Ren, although you still enjoyed that part very much, consenting wholeheartedly to let him pleasure you in whatever new ways you and he could think of. No, instead, you had found bravery, courage, and strength that you didn't know you had. And it didn't just have to do with your force powers either. You had learned how to defend yourself, both with a staff and with your two bare hands. You had learned to use your cunning to help save your friends. You had learned how to trust in Kylo, even though you had every reason not to, and you had learned how to rely on yourself and your own instincts in order to survive. You may not have been the same person that entered Starkiller Base as an interpreter, but you could now appreciate how much stronger you had become. You felt like you had completed a part of yourself that you hadn't even realized that you were missing, and as much as you hated to admit it, it didn't just come from your stubborn sense of self-reliance, a trait that you had always harbored since your youth. You had been vulnerable with Kylo in ways that you had never been vulnerable before, and you loved him, not unconditionally, but absolutely, unabashedly, and unapologetically. As cheesy as it sounded, you were really and truly bonded to him, whether through the Force or by something else entirely, and you could just imagine Sadie telling you that you had found your soulmate. You would have given her a hard time about it, of course, but a secret part of you, the part of you that curled up beside Kylo every night, would agree that she was right. Truly, curling up with him at the end of every night was always the best part of your day. You remembered back when you had first slept with him, and you had tried to memorize the way his lips felt pressed against yours, the way his fingertips moved against your skin, and the intoxicating bliss of his hot breath against your ear as he whispered your name. But you didn't have to do that anymore. Now you could relax around him, just passively enjoying the way he slept, with his face sometimes pressed against the crook of your neck, or the way he slept with his arms wrapped firmly around you, secretly wishing that one night when you were snuggled up together, time itself would freeze, and you would be free to just spend the rest of eternity together in that moment. You wish it could have lasted forever, and in truth, a part of you always suspected that it would end somewhere or another, but you couldn't ever really imagine how. You and Kylo were bonded. It didn't seem like it was possible for one of you to go on without the other. But what existed between you and Kylo was a good thing. And although you had never met him, you would have agreed with Supreme Leader Snoke. Despite how much you wished against it, all good things would eventually end. Change was inevitable. There are no happy stories that last forever.